Now, everybody out there has heard, probably in the last, I don't know, call it 5 to 10 years, everybody knows about getting the amygdala hijack experience. What's the amygdala hijack experience, if you don't know that? Well, basically, your amygdala is part of your brain, and what happens is it manages a lot of emotional stuff and regulation, especially when it comes to threat and danger. And what happens is when there is a perceived, key word there, buddies, listen to that word, perceived. Now remember, our perceptions are not always accurate, okay? But a perceived threat, then if there is a danger, and a threat can be something's wrong in my map of the world. I'm driving down the street and all of a sudden there's a log in the street. Okay, that's a perceived threat, right? You perceive that my map, I got to swerve. I can't drive like I normally do. There's danger. I've got to avoid this in some way. A perceived threat, when we perceive that there's a threat, sometimes that can come from inside of our heads as well as outside of our heads. But anyway, that's the way you're wired. That's a good thing that you got this fight or flight. Let me add another F to it. Freeze, fight, flight, or freeze response. When there is danger, the whole brain shoots out a bunch of instructions. And the instructions are to protect yourself in one of those ways. Fight or flight are the protective maneuvers, right? Somebody comes at you, you might push back, fight to protect yourself. Or if it's your style A, or even if the threat is larger than your ability to fight, there's a power imbalance. There can be a flight. Run for the hills, your brain says. Get out of there. Leave the conflict. Shut down. And what we do is we walk out of the room. I'm done. I can't talk about this anymore. Whatever that is, there's a moving away. Passive aggressive is a term that you hear sometimes instead of aggressive, instead of somebody entering into and pushing against, like some people do with their anger and other kinds of over aggressive moves. The passive aggressive person will do that passively by withdrawing. Okay. But there's some sort of reaction that we all have. Guess what, guys? You are not bad for having that. You couldn't live without it. If you went to a hot stove and there is, you're boiling water, okay, and steam came up in your face, what would you do? You would move back. Good move. Really good move. Really good move. Fight or flight. It's automatic. Guess what else it does? It's designed to do this. It shuts down your brain in your ability to think, in your ability to choose options, in your ability to creatively solve a problem, in your ability to judge and discern between options and figure out which one's the most appropriate in a linear path of where you want to end up. Creative problem solving, releasing of resources. That's your higher brain. Well, this makes sense why it would do that, right? Think about this. If I'm walking down a railroad track, out on a stroll, I grew up in the South, small town. I mean, it's a real city. We thought it was. Don't you call my small town not a city. It was. We had everything. But it wasn't too far out of town, which there was, it's the Delta, Mississippi Delta. There's farmland, there's woods. I loved it. Hunting and hiking. Sometimes you come across a railroad track. Well, there might be a curve there or whatever. It's coming through, you can't see forever down there. And you're walking on a railroad track and then you hear this like that. Well, let's say that you're particularly kind of like not attuned that day and there's a curve or whatever. And I have heard those train whistles or horns or whatever you call them be really loud all of a sudden. If a train's coming at you, the last thing you want to do at that moment is sit there and have your higher brain go to a brainstorming retreat. In other words, you don't want to be going, I hear a train. I wonder if that's a real danger or not. I wonder how fast it's coming. What's the speed at which the train is traveling? I wonder how much it weighs. Let's do the calculations. How much time to, no. If it's really close or a car's coming at you, what do you want to do? You don't have time to think, you react. So you could turn and punch out the train. That would be fight. Okay. Probably not. Your brain knows enough to know, I can't punch out the train. So what does it do? It flight. You dive off the track instantly. That's good. You don't want a bunch of thinking interfering with your ability to react. Okay. But here's the problem. A lot of times there aren't trains coming at us. They're not. Most times it's a person. And except in, abuse situations or violence or whatever, certainly if you're being abused or in some kind of danger, obviously, have to seek protection, run, fight, whatever you got to do, to be safe, get help, all of that. But I'm talking about the non-abuse situations where we get activated, or let's say I get triggered in some way by something that I'm not in the kind of danger to the degree to which I react. In other words, I kind of lose it and react and yell at somebody and everybody else is looking and go, why are you reacting that way? Why are you, or we get amped up, or we say, fine, fine, I don't want to talk about it. And we exit the conversation. See, like everything else in life, we can have needed, appropriate when you're really in danger. We can have needed and appropriate fight or flight or freeze reactions. But also, we're not perfect and we aren't always doing risk assessment accurately. And sometimes there's no real danger, or not the danger to which the extent is that we are reacting. Now, again, I'm not talking about you're being victimized or hurt. I want you to obviously seek safety. But let's say that somebody, I don't know, it could be at work, it could be at home or whatever. Where we see this a lot is in marriage. A lot of times I can't tell you how many, let's just say husbands for a moment, how many husbands I've talked to who are saying, well, she's so critical and she's so this. And I'll go, really? That's not, and then I talk with her and get her in there. And basically she's just saying, hey, would you mind, instead of throwing it on the floor, would you mind picking it up and putting it in the hamper? You're always on my case. See, there's a reaction to something that's really not, it shouldn't be a threat. Okay, or feedback, for example. A lot of times this happens psychologically in criticism is what we call it. And sometimes, certainly, there are better ways to give feedback to each other than the ways that some people give them. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about really is, or even in that case, it's incumbent upon us to grow past and mature past our adrenaline-based reactions to each other and keep our heads. Many of my favorite verses are about managing anger. What we know in the long-term effects of parental anger on children is way more significant than people realize. Parents reacting, What are you doing? Why, I told you to. See, those are not higher brain parenting responses. You know, we like to use the word sometimes, let's respond instead of react. And that's a good way of framing what I'm talking about. Because there are better choices than to fight or flight. So here's what I want you to do. Let's take the real dangerous stuff off the table for a second. But let's talk about the way that you and I and all humans, a lot of stuff I do, you know, in high performance teams is about this. You know, we only get to higher answers and higher functioning by going through debate, going through disagreement, going through conflict. But if we don't have any options other than our fight or flight response to if something feels threatening to us, now what I mean is, I'm talking about psychologically threatening to something that shouldn't feel threatening, like if somebody gives me feedback, or you know, there's a criticism, or even whatever it is. One of my favorite verses is, "Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, again, real danger aside, real abuse aside, what I'm talking about here is a lot of times people will give us dysfunction. They'll give us an immature response. Relationships break down when we're floating along at this level and somebody does something immature, and that immaturity pulls me down to their level. And now I get snitty back. They're sarcastic, I get sarcastic back. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You be nice to me, I'll be nice to you. But if you don't, then you better watch out. Well, that's not how we take something to a higher level. We take something to a higher level by learning to modulate maybe that initial amping up inside. And I want you to learn to recognize it. When you feel it internally, take a little time out before you respond. And maybe there's a better way to respond to a kid or a spouse or a friend or whatever it is than my lower brain is telling me to respond. That's what we call emotional regulation. Emotional regulation. It's when everything in me wants to fight or flight, but it's not appropriate to the threat level. That's part of how we overcome trauma, is the hypervigilance of the being amped up, because what you were traumatized by originally, it was appropriate to, what's the old theological term, get the hell out of Dodge, right? You should need protection. You should need to run. You should, it was appropriate. You know, if a war veteran gets PTSD and they get amped up, certainly they're amped up for a good reason. They come back, and I've experienced this with vets. They might hear somebody close a drawer loud, and it triggers. And I've seen them dissociate and go into full combat. And so part of emotional regulation and healing of PTSD is getting that to calm down. Well, most of us are not, and we haven't experienced that kind of PTSD, but all humans, we can be overreactive. And so I just want you to learn to tune in to your amping, because what it's doing is it's making you powerless sometimes. Sometimes you might move away from a conflict that you really could set a boundary with, you really could confront, you really could choose something different than an old pattern. So anyway, take a moment before you respond. Take a moment before you react. Notice what you're feeling, and don't just let your adrenaline speak for you. Notice what you're feeling. Take a deep breath and ask yourself, What would be the response here that might get the best outcome? Emotional regulation. Sometimes, for some of you, it may be even to have a stronger reaction, to have more fight than freeze. You can say no when you didn't think you could. You can learn to set a boundary. You can learn to do this, or you can learn to not be overcome by the freeze and fear. But that's all growth. That's what we do in building boundary skills. But it also goes the other way. Some of our boundaries are reactive. And we need to learn to not be reactive, still have the boundary. But instead of the speaking the truth in rage, one of my favorite verses says, speak the truth in love. So be firm. Okay. You're immovable. I'm not going to put up with that. But I'm also not going to add to the conflict in name calling and all sorts of stuff. It doesn't get us to an answer. Emotional regulation. This is what mature people do. Have you ever seen somebody? My favorite examples are the bouncers. Got this bouncer in a bar. They're pretty much the most calm person around, and some nitwit comes along and starts to kind of pick a fight, and they'll go, "Dude, let's just calm down here. Let's go talk about this. Let's go outside and kind of talk about this." They don't react. Why? Because they've also developed a lot of resilience and strength inside. Okay, so just something to think about. Again, I'm not saying if you're in danger to not react and don't get out of there. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when our reaction is more than the moment. And it causes us to lose some good options. There are better ways to respond to kids' behavior than anger, or even a lot of times spouses or teammates or people we love.